How one mountain man's secret tricks brought light to his cabin. Snow had not stopped for 3 days. It lay heavy on the pine roofs and made the air taste of metal and smoke. Far in the mountains, a cabin stood alone. No road signs, no footprints leading to it, only the thin ribbon of chimney smoke rising into a bruised grey sky. Inside, an old man named Eli sat by the dying fire, his hands cracked from years of chopping wood, and his breath slow, as if afraid to disturb the silence that owned this valley. Every morning he woke before light, lit the same kerosene lamp, and waited for the sun that never seemed to reach his windows. The cabin was a museum of quiet survival, jars of beans, patched blankets, a photograph turned face down on the table. Eli had built everything here with his own hands, from the stone fireplace to the wooden chair that creaked each time he leaned forward. But lately, something inside him had begun to rot, not his body but the will that once kept him alive. He had grown tired of the dark. The winters were longer now, the nights colder, and even fire couldn't chase away the loneliness crawling through the corners. Then, one morning, while chopping wood behind the cabin, he heard something faint, a soft tapping like knuckles on hollow wood. He stopped, turned, and found a small shape near the tree line. At first he thought it was an animal, but when he stepped closer, he saw a child, thin, wrapped in torn flannel, her cheeks red from frostbite. She didn't move, only looked at him with eyes too calm for her age. Eli dropped the axe. The silence between them grew thick, almost sacred. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. Eli carried the child inside, her body cold and weightless, like a bundle of wet leaves. He laid her near the fire, covered her with a wool blanket, and poured a few drops of melted snow between her lips. She didn't speak. Her eyes followed the flickering flame, unblinking, like someone who had already seen too much of the world to trust it again. The sound of the storm outside filled the silence between them. Wind clawing against the cabin walls, snow hissing against the glass. Eli crouched by her side, his joints cracking as he reached for more wood. For a long time he said nothing. He had learned that silence was safer than words. But now that same silence felt cruel. The girl's hands were blue, her face pale, and her breath uneven, as if she didn't know if she was allowed to survive. He looked at her and saw the ghost of another winter long ago, when his own daughter had coughed herself to death in this very cabin while he was away cutting firewood. He had buried her with frozen hands, whispering to a ground too hard to listen. The memory hit him like a quiet knife. He stood up abruptly, walked to the door, and gripped the handle. He could leave her there. It wasn't his problem. The world had taken enough from him, his wife, his child, his reason to care. Why open the wound again? But then the girl shivered, and a small sound escaped her. Not a word, just a breath that trembled like a plea. It was enough. Eli turned back. He knelt again, tucked the blanket tighter around her, and fed another log to the fire. "You'll stay," he muttered, not sure if he was talking to her or to the ghost of his daughter still buried beneath the snow. He poured a bit of broth into a tin cup and held it to her mouth. She sipped once, her eyes never leaving his. Something shifted, not in the air but in him. That frozen place inside his chest, the one that had forgotten warmth, cracked just a little. Outside, the storm raged louder, as if the mountain itself disapproved of his decision. But Eli didn't care. For the first time in years, he had chosen to save instead of bury. By dawn, the storm had quieted, leaving the world buried beneath a hush so deep that even breath sounded intrusive. Eli opened the cabin door to fetch more wood and froze. Fresh tracks cut across the snow, deep, heavy, and recent. Not the small footprints of the girl, but boots. More than one pair. They came from the ridge and stopped just a few yards from his porch before turning back toward the trees. Whoever they were, they had found the cabin, and then left. For now, Eli's gut twisted. He glanced inside. The girl still slept near the fire, her small chest rising unevenly under the blanket. He shut the door quietly, bolting it, then sat at the table with his coffee gone cold. Something wasn't right. She hadn't spoken a word, not even a name. But when he'd cleaned her hands the night before, he'd noticed bruises, old ones, circling her wrists like rope marks. Someone had tied her. Someone who might be looking for her. By mid-morning she stirred. He offered her a bowl of oatmeal, but she only stared at it. Then softly she whispered, "They'll come." The words crawled down his spine. "Who?" he asked, his voice rough. She didn't answer. Instead, she looked toward the window, eyes distant, as if she could still see the men behind the storm. He realized then she hadn't been lost in the woods. She had been running. That evening, while Eli chopped wood outside, he caught a flash of movement by the ridge, a figure in a dark coat, watching. He pretended not to see, kept swinging the axe, but his heart hammered. When he finally went back inside, he pushed the table against the door. The girl sat awake now, hugging her knees, whispering to herself. In the dim firelight, he noticed the emblem on her torn sleeve, a faded insignia from the mining camp 20 miles south. He remembered that place. Men there didn't work for wages. They worked for survival, and some took what wasn't theirs. Eli sat by the window all night with the rifle across his lap. The mountains were silent again, but he knew silence was only a pause between echoes. Whoever had hurt her would return, and when they did, they'd find an old man waiting, one who had already buried enough of his own. Outside, the wind picked up again, howling like a warning across the frozen trees. Inside, the lamp flickered, and in its trembling light 2 souls waited for the storm to come back. The days grew longer, though the sun still hid behind the ridges most mornings. Eli and the girl found a rhythm, quiet, practical, and wordless. He chopped wood while she sat by the door, mending torn gloves with thread from his old coat. Sometimes she followed him to the river, her steps small but steady, and helped carry water back in tin pails that clanged like small bells in the frozen air. He never asked her name again. He didn't need to. In silence, names mattered less than the act of staying. One evening the fire burned low, and he caught her staring at the rifle mounted above the door. Her eyes were full of questions she didn't dare ask. Eli took it down, checked the barrel, and placed it in her hands. "It's heavier than it looks," he said quietly. She held it awkwardly, her fingers trembling. He guided her stance with a gentle touch on her shoulder, the same way he'd once taught his daughter. Slow, patient, steady. The shot cracked through the valley, echoing off the snow. She flinched, but he saw something shift in her, a flicker of power returning to a body that had only known fear. That night, as the wind howled, Eli found her sitting awake by the hearth, staring into the flames. He noticed the burn scars along her wrist, thin, pale lines disappearing into her sleeve. He didn't ask what happened. He only poured her a cup of hot broth and placed it beside her. She didn't drink right away, just nodded once, as if understanding the unspoken rule between them. No past, no questions, only survival. When he finally lay down, he couldn't sleep. The crackling fire sounded too much like the past, the night his cabin had burned, the night he'd lost his family. He sat up and saw her curled beside the fireplace, her small hands clutching the blanket. Something inside him, that old aching guilt, began to thaw. He realized this girl wasn't here to remind him of what he'd lost. She was here to show him what he still had left to protect. The next morning, she was already awake, feeding the chickens. When he stepped outside, she looked up at him and smiled. Just a small one, uncertain and soft. It wasn't much, but it was more light than the mountain had seen in years. Inside, the cabin no longer felt empty. The silence between them had changed. No longer hollow, but human. Like warmth finding its way back into forgotten walls. It happened on the 4th night, after the snow began to melt. Eli woke to the sound of boots crunching outside. Not the uncertain shuffle of wildlife, but the sharp, deliberate rhythm of men who had come for something. The fire inside the cabin had burned low, throwing faint orange veins across the wooden floor. The girl stirred, half asleep, her hand clutching the edge of the blanket. Eli put a finger to his lips. She froze. Through the narrow window, he saw 3 figures moving between the trees, rifles slung, lantern light cutting through the mist. One called out, voice thick with command. "We know she's in there, old man. Step out before we make you." Eli's heartbeat slowed, not from fear but from an old practiced calm. He'd seen men like them before, the kind who believed the mountain and everything on it belonged to them. He reached for his rifle, the one he'd cleaned with her just days ago, and whispered, "Get under the floorboards." She hesitated, eyes wide, then obeyed, slipping into the hidden space beneath the rug. He pulled the trapdoor shut just as the first bang rattled the door. The cabin shuddered. Another voice, cruel, mocking, followed. "You think you can hide her? She's ours. Belongs to the camp." Eli stepped forward, gun steady. "No one belongs to you." A moment of silence. Then the door burst open, cold air flooding in along with two men, faces scarred by labor and greed. The leader stayed outside, shadow stretching across the... "Snow, you've got no right, old man," he spat. Eli aimed low, warning first. "Neither do you." They laughed, but not for long. The first shot cracked like thunder, echoing through the valley. One man fell, the lantern shattering beside him, flames licking the floorboards. The second lunged, knocking Eli backward, a struggle of breath and fists, until the rifle went off again. Silence followed except for the fire's hiss. The leader's voice rose from outside, furious. "You'll burn with her, then." He tossed a torch through the broken doorway. Flames bloomed instantly, greedy and bright. Eli turned, coughing through the smoke. He pulled the rug aside, reached into the floor, and dragged the girl out. She tried to protest, but he pressed the rifle into her hands. "Down the river path," he rasped. "Follow the light when it comes." "What about you?" she whispered. He looked at her, really looked, and in her frightened eyes he saw both his daughter and the reason he'd survived this long. He smiled faintly. "Cabin's seen enough dark. Someone's got to bring the light." As the fire swallowed the doorway, Eli stepped back inside. The last thing she saw was his silhouette framed against the blaze, still unflinching, like a man who had finally chosen what he was meant to save. The night swallowed the mountain whole. Smoke drifted low through the trees, thick and slow, carrying the bitter scent of burning pine and memory. The girl ran until her lungs ached, until the fire behind her was no longer a glow, but a faint whisper in the dark sky. When she finally stopped by the frozen river, her knees gave out. She fell to the ground, trembling, clutching the rifle Eli had pressed into her hands. The metal was still warm from his touch. The silence around her was immense, the kind that made every heartbeat sound like a drum. The water murmured under a thin layer of ice, carrying ash downstream. She turned back once. From where she sat, the cabin was gone, only the faint pulse of flame flickering between the trees. For a moment, she thought she saw him, his outline framed by firelight, head bowed, shoulders steady. But maybe it was just the mountain's shadow playing tricks. She waited until dawn. The fire had died by then, leaving nothing but a column of grey smoke rising against a pale sky. Slowly she made her way back. The air was sharp, cutting against her face, and every step crunched over snow that had turned black with soot. The cabin's roof had collapsed, beams melted into the earth, but near the fireplace, the only part still standing, something shone faintly in the ash. A tin cup. Beside it, a folded photograph, edges charred but image clear enough to see. Eli, a young woman and a little girl with braids. Her breath caught. She knelt, tracing the faces with cold fingers. Around her the forest was still. No birds, no wind, just the quiet acceptance of a world that keeps moving after it's broken. She didn't cry. Instead, she gathered the photograph, wrapped it in cloth, and placed it inside her coat. Then she picked up the rifle, slung it across her shoulder, and began to walk toward the ridge. By afternoon, sunlight broke through the clouds for the first time in days. It hit the snow in golden sheets, and the girl stopped, lifting her face toward it. The warmth startled her, not because it was rare, but because it felt like him. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank you," though no one was there to hear. Somewhere far below, the river carried the last ashes of the cabin downstream. The mountain, for the first time in years, shimmered with light. Years passed before anyone spoke the old man's name again. The mountain reclaimed what was left of his cabin, grass pushing through ash, wildflowers curling where fire had once fed. The river carved new paths, carrying the remnants of that winter far into the valleys below. But every spring, when the snow began to melt, a faint shimmer of light still lingered in that hollow, as if refusing to forget him. The girl grew up far from the mountain. She found work in a small town, sweeping floors in a diner and learning to speak without fear. People often asked about the rifle she carried, worn smooth by time, but she never told them. On her nights off, she would light a lantern outside her small wooden home and leave it burning till dawn, a habit she couldn't explain. Maybe it was her way of calling the light back, the way he had once done for her. Every year, when the first snow fell, she walked into the woods alone, following the old river path. She knew where the cabin had been, though nothing remained. There, beneath the roots of a pine tree, she placed a single item, something new each year, a cup, a small carving, once even a photograph she'd drawn from memory. She never stayed long, just enough to whisper, "I'm still here." As the years folded into one another, her hair turned the color of frost. But the lanterns never stopped burning. From a distance, travelers sometimes saw a faint glow between the trees and spoke of a ghostly fire that never died. They didn't know it wasn't a haunting. It was remembrance. Some lights, once given, never go out.